Welcome to Silicon Wafers. Please, if you like this content, make sure you're subscribed to this main channel, but also to Silicon Wafers, which is the new channel which will host a lot of these deep dive news stories. Please also do buy me a coffee or become a patron to help support the work of the channel. This is now the main thing I do, and therefore it's important to help keep this going. The 13th, Z blogger Yegor Guzenko, who publishes under the name of the 13th, seems to have lost his mind, or at least is losing faith in his masters in the Kremlin and in the special military operation, the SVO. Everything that is happening now is treachery, he screams in several video messages posted in his Telegram channel this week. Traitors are sitting in the Kremlin. Some writers, some Z patriots and bloggers have been permitted to criticize underlings and intermediaries of the Tsar throughout this war. Governors and even the Ministry of Defense have been allowed to become the target of criticism, especially when they mess up. But hurling abuse at the boss in the Red Fortress is off limits and always has been. The 13th has more than 300,000 subscribers and seems to have crossed a line when he spoke harshly about the Kremlin and the current Russian government, as well as indirectly throwing accusations in Putin's direction. The outburst is really quite something, and even though his team later deleted these recordings, the fate of the 13th may already have been sealed. Unlucky for some is the obvious comment. If 10 years ago, he rants, if one old man would have not messed up and would have gone, honestly admitted his F up, then all this fuckery would not have happened. Everything that is happening now is a betrayal. The traitors are sitting in the Kremlin. Guzenko has said that Russian authorities are removing inconvenient Z patriot bloggers by putting them in jail, including the terrorist Yegor Girkin, who he named as an example. Guzenko elaborated conspiratorially that traitors have taken over the country, explaining that he is not afraid to say so because it is impossible to put all of the people in jail. That is perhaps a little optimistic. If history has shown anything, it's that Russia can put a lot of people in jail, and fairly nasty jails come to that, and quite a few of them never come back from there. The Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, picked up this story over the weekend, claiming that several mill bloggers had been describing how the Kremlin was co-opting them to regulate the spread of information in Russia and was attempting to encourage critics to self-censor out of fear of punishment. This is something we've talked about on the channel more than a year ago, that the license to critique the military would be curtailed after Prigozhin's failed mutiny, which happened just over a year ago. So who is Yegor Guzenko? He's a war criminal that has fought in Donbass since 2014 and Syria in 2019. By the time of the full-scale war in Ukraine, he was under house arrest. In March 2022, he cut off his electronic tracking bracelet and fled to join the war in Ukraine. After he called the inhabitants of the Kremlin effing traitors, it seems he was asked why he is not afraid to speak. So, he said, you can be imprisoned, Guzenko explained. Well, why would they put us all in prison? Why would they kill us all even? There are a lot of us. We are a whole country. And you have a bunch sitting there in the Kremlin that are old already. They will die soon. And we are young. We will figure it out. Does this kind of rant remind us of anyone? Prigozhin, perhaps. But that did not end well for him or the people he surrounded himself with. And Girkin also, who assisted Russia's hybrid invasion of the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea, but was detained at his home in July 2023, is also known to speak in this fashion. He has been publishing commentary critical of Russia's military strategy and setbacks since Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. But when he spoke out against the boss of bosses, then his card was marked. The current rumors suggest that Girkin will be allowed to go to the front, probably some hotspot where he can end his ignoble life in some pointless meatwave assault. Good riddance will be the reaction of all but the most ardent Russian Z patriots. Girkin was a terrorist, a mass murderer, and a Russian imperialist. Days before his arrest, Girkin called the Russian president a cowardly mediocrity and said that Russia would not survive another presidential term by Putin. Whereas there is much truth in this statement, talking truth to power in Russia is quite a lethal pastime to adopt. The ICW suggests that such incidents imply the Kremlin is attempting to co-opt mill bloggers or encouraging them to self-censor, as opposed to more aggressive, direct censorship. But the publication of these critical videos demonstrates how the Kremlin has not been successful at co-opting or silencing the entire Russian information space. However, the later retraction of Guzenko's video suggests the Kremlin has actually been quite successful at coercing mill bloggers, even some of the most outspoken voices, as well as the administrative teams that handle their channels, persuading them to self-censor out of fear of potential punishment. It may still prove to be the case, however, that Guzenko's outburst crossed a line and will trigger harsher retribution. It could be a case of pick your poison, open windows on top floors of buildings, strangely tasting tea, exotic and excruciatingly painful poisons, or something more mundane like a car crash, plane crash, or sudden and completely unexpected medical emergency. There seem to be some common patterns, however, in the narratives of these mill bloggers. They do not complain about the war being unjust or show any empathy towards Ukrainians. Rather, it's a narrative of victimhood and betrayal, usually by politicians and incompetent military officers. It's not the war they object to, but losing the war, fighting badly, being led badly, and ultimately losing to Ukrainians, who they see as inferior beings from a country that should not even exist. Possibly not unlike the bitter and resentful attitudes of some German soldiers after World War I, when narratives about betrayal by officers was prevalent. Guzenko, for instance, believes that in fact 30 years ago, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Yeltsin sold the country out to America, and everything that's happened now is a betrayal, a continuation of that betrayal. Traitors are in the Kremlin, that's it, period, he says. Planes are crashing, explosions are happening, they're removing inconvenient people, putting them in prison, doing whatever they want. That is, well, guys, we should understand that returning from the front to the world, in fact, the war is not ending, and it will not end. Perhaps no one will ever give the order to even end it, because traitors have captured the country. There are enemies everywhere. That's it. I have no other words. This is, of course, Guzenko talking, and he seems to understand quite well that his words may have consequences. He understands that Z bloggers are being used, coerced, even terrorized, and that many bloggers, including him, are being directly threatened. But he says they won't kill anyone. Parts of me feels there is a certain naivety to some of his statements, a certain attitude that bad things may happen to others, but not to him, suggesting that insulting the Tsar, questioning his authority and right to make decisions over war and peace, even Putin's mental competence to do so, and imply that the Tsar is a traitor to the motherland, suggest all of this, and still to expect to live, especially considering what happened to Prigozhin, is a little delusional. Guzenko continues. There is a tough grass that grows on the plains, he says, called chuck. There are horses everywhere in the pastures and they trample the grass down, but it still breaks through. And so it is with us, the people of Russia. That's how it is. They'll trample us, kill us. It's no big deal. We'll get back up. It seems that Russians are buying into this myth as well, that not only are their lands endless and borderless, but that their human and material resources are infinite. But it's simply not so. And this hints at how this war may in fact end, simply that Putin keeps his country at war with everyone until everything runs out or he dies, whichever comes first. Putin will burn up all of Russia and its people before he sacrifices himself. In that respect, Guzenko is right. Putin is not only a traitor to his people, but is prepared to have them slaughtered wholesale to save his own neck, simply for a few more years of life and control, and to retain his ill-gotten gains while he was in power. Guzenko expresses some interesting things that have turned him against the Kremlin, and we can only speculate as to whether these sentiments are shared by other Z bloggers and patriots. I've already waited 3 years, kept quiet, he says. Well, I won't keep quiet anymore because, well, how long will this go on? Maniacs, pedophiles, rapists are forgiven. When it all started, I was under investigation and there was no program to let criminals off their sentences in return for fighting in Ukraine. Well, all the best to you, I said, and off I went. That's it. There are many different unfair things. For 3 years now, I've been brainwashed. For 3 years now, I have been an outlaw. This outburst seems to have been triggered when Guzenko suddenly found out that another blogger, Alexander Volkov, had a criminal case opened against him. But this is partly how the system works. The regime tries to keep bloggers in check with the threat of prosecution for real or imaginary misdemeanors. And the bloggers are told what they can and what they cannot say, because in fact they are not free agents. They are mouthpieces of propaganda. If they allow themselves to write about what is really happening, to say something unnecessary and not in the reports that are provided by the Ministry of Defense, then people knock on their doors. They get taken away. The system of coercion and control works in a variety of ways. One person is given money, another hit on the head, someone is imprisoned, like Igor Strelkov Girkin, and others blown up, like Vladimir Tartarsky or Yevgeny Prigozhin. The situations can be very different, but ultimately the vast ecosystem of social media propaganda exists, or rather is tolerated, to propagate narratives amenable to the Ministry of Defense. With Kursk, the situation may be changing a little and tightening up in terms of secrecy on the regime's side, but also dissatisfaction could be building on the side of the regime mouthpieces. At the start of the Kursk operation by the armed forces of Ukraine, some bloggers began to write that it was a complete failure for Russia, that a catastrophe was unfolding. That is, the shock of defeat was so intense, Ukrainian strength so obvious, they lost sight of their actual mission, their mission to lie on behalf of the regime. But literally a few days later, they began to say once more that everything was under control. The enemy was stopped and was being squeezed out, etc., etc. Everyone is great, and therefore nothing bad is happening in the Kursk region, when the reality was that the armed forces of Ukraine had captured approximately twice as much territory in Russia as Russian forces had captured in the previous 6 months in Ukraine. And they are still in Kursk, dug in and expanding the territory they control incrementally. There's no sign that Russia is going to dislodge them anytime soon, and almost certainly not this side of winter. So the pressures on Z bloggers seem to be the same now under Belousov as it was under Shoigu. Nothing has changed in this regard, and nothing is likely to change. What can we learn from this? That on the ground, Russia cannot handle complex, agile maneuver warfare, as their military hierarchy is rigid and brittle. Communications and logistics are poor, but also suggests that their propaganda construct may also be rigid and brittle as well. It also tells us that the regime's capacity for lying to its people is nearly infinite, but that the Z blogger ecosystem can fracture if enough pressure is applied. If the reality of defeats on Russian territory is too great, some of the regime's underlings and mouthpieces may break ranks, get drunk and rant on camera, turn on their own, and make various unforgivable, unretractable statements. In short, apply enough pressure and Russians will turn on each other with vitriol, blame, loathing, envy, and possibly with violence. Their thwarted imperial lust and aggressive victimhood is a toxic mix that can turn inwards just as much as it is projected outwards. The enmities, rivalries, greed, and hatreds of the people that participate in Putin's informational dictatorship may well break out into the open when they turn on each other as the regime's failure becomes too big to hide. We can only hope.